We all have this deeply ingrained picture of what an empath looks like. We see them as the ultimate shock absorber of human emotion, the person who walks into a room heavy with tension and immediately starts breathing it in, neutralizing it, and carrying it for everyone else. They are the ones who listen endlessly, who always find a way to excuse bad behavior because they can see the wounded inner child hiding behind it, and who would rather set themselves on fire than let someone else feel cold. For years, this dynamic rolls along like a predictable machine. The manipulator pokes, tests, shifts blame, and creates chaos, and the empath quietly stretches their emotional capacity just a little bit further to accommodate it, truly believing that if they just love hard enough, understand deeply enough, and stay patient long enough, the other person will finally change. But beneath that endless ocean of patience, a completely different mechanism is quietly running in the background, far away from conscious thought. Our nervous systems are not built to stay in a state of chronic, low-grade stress forever, no matter how kind or strong we think we are. There is a very specific, utterly silent day when this entire dynamic shatters into a million pieces, and it almost never happens the way people in movies think it does. There are no flying plates, no dramatic slamming doors, and no tearful screaming matches in the driveway. In fact, to an outside observer, nothing looks different at all. It usually happens behind closed eyes, late at night in an empty room, or right in the middle of a totally normal conversation when the manipulator is mid-sentence, dropping their usual subtle jab or guilt trip. In that exact microsecond, something inside the empath's brain snaps, not in a broken way, but in a freeing way. The internal threat detection system, the ancient part of the brain that guards our survival, finally overrules the deep-seated desire to keep the peace and fix the relationship. It looks at the endless cycle of broken promises, manufactured drama, and emotional exhaustion, and flashes a blinding red warning light that says, "This is no longer a relationship. This is a slow-motion hazard to your health." The nervous system realizes that the very person the empath trusted is actually the primary source of danger. And just like that, the endless well of understanding runs completely, permanently dry. On this exact day, the empath undergoes a chillingly sudden psychological transformation. They completely stop trying to figure out why the manipulator acts the way they do. They stop running mental simulations to decode hidden meanings. They stop searching their own memories to see if they accidentally caused the problem. And they stop trying to translate the manipulator's toxic behavior into something loving. Instead, the fog lifts entirely, and they step back to observe the behavior like a cold, detached scientist looking at a strange specimen under a laboratory microscope. They watch the manipulation unfold in real time, the tiny lies, the guilt shifting, the subtle bait, and for the first time, they feel zero emotional charge attached to it. They are no longer a participant trapped inside the storm. They are simply a person watching the weather change from behind a thick glass window, completely untouched, completely awake, and completely done. To understand how a warm, endlessly caring person can turn into ice, you have to look at what is actually happening deep inside their biology. Because this transformation is not a choice they consciously wake up and make. It is a survival mechanism. What triggers this permanent shift is a brutal combination of emotional burnout and total cognitive exhaustion. For years, the manipulator has been running a very specific psychological playbook known as intermittent reinforcement, which is essentially the exact same mechanism that keeps people addicted to slot machines. They dish out tiny, rare drops of genuine affection, validation, or sweetness, right after long stretches of chaos, silent treatment, criticism, or unpredictability. The empath's brain gets hopelessly hooked on these breadcrumbs of warmth, constantly chasing the high of that rare good moment and convincing themselves that the sweet person they saw on day one is the real one, and the toxic behavior is just an accident. But human nervous systems have a hard, unforgiving biological limit. We are simply not wired to live in a perpetual state of chemical whiplash, constantly bouncing between the stress of a crisis and the relief of a temporary truce. Over time, the brain's internal prediction machinery gets exhausted from trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. Day after day, the empath throws more empathy, more patience, and more understanding at the problem, waiting for the equation to finally balance out, waiting for the other person to finally realize the damage they are causing. But eventually, a threshold is crossed. The brain's survival center runs the data and delivers a chilling, undeniable conclusion. No amount of empathy, sacrifice, or love will ever yield actual safety, stability, or true emotional reciprocity with this person. The exact moment that truth lands in the mind, a biological switch is violently flipped, and the brain's reward circuitry simply shuts down. Psychologists call this emotional detachment. But if you ask anyone who has actually lived through it, they will tell you it feels like an internal thermometer instantly dropping to absolute zero. The engines that used to run hot with worry, the constant compulsion to fix things, the desperate urge to explain your feelings, and the endless need to understand why the other person is so cruel, all of it completely vanishes in a single heartbeat. The fire of investment goes out entirely, and in its place comes a strange, deeply unsettling, immovable stillness. You stop chasing, you stop pleading, and you stop caring about the outcome, leaving the manipulator staring into a vacuum where a warm, beating heart used to be. When this absolute internal shift happens, the dynamic of the relationship changes overnight, and the manipulator suddenly finds themselves standing in total darkness because they have just lost their most powerful tool, emotional leverage. For the entire history of the relationship, the manipulator's control rested entirely on the fact that the empath cared. They cared about the peace. They cared about fairness. They cared about the relationship surviving. And most importantly, they cared deeply about how the manipulator felt. But when that caring is completely stripped away, the manipulator's entire toolkit instantly becomes useless. They try rolling out their classic greatest hits, deploying the usual heavy guilt trips to make the empath feel like the bad guy, dropping subtle gaslighting comments to make them second-guess their own memory, or suddenly pivoting to weaponized vulnerability, putting on a heartbreaking act of being the real victim who is deeply hurt. Yet to their utter shock and confusion, every single one of those tactics bounces straight off an invisible, impenetrable wall. The guilt trips fall completely flat because the empath no longer carries a shred of undeserved shame. The gaslighting fails because the empath no longer needs validation from the very person who is trying to distort reality. Even the weaponized tears and fake vulnerability don't work anymore, because the sympathy that used to rush forward to rescue the manipulator has permanently dried up. The reason this happens is simple yet profound. The empath is no longer emotionally invested in the outcome of the interaction whatsoever. They have entirely stopped fighting for a resolution. They have stopped arguing over who is right and who is wrong, and they have completely let go of the exhausting desire to get closure from someone who is incapable of giving it. Most surprisingly, they no longer care in the slightest if the manipulator finally understands the immense pain and damage they caused. The desperate need for the other person to wake up, see the truth, and say, "I'm sorry," has totally evaporated into thin air. Because that fundamental need for approval and understanding is gone, the empath stops looking at the manipulator with emotional eyes and starts seeing right through the performance. When the manipulator throws a tantrum, acts cold, or tries to pull their usual mind games, the empath looks right through the tactics and clearly sees the pathetic, cringing insecurity and raw desperation driving them underneath. They realize that every single toxic move is just a scared, weak reflex from someone terrified of losing control. And because they see the engine behind the machinery, the manipulation loses all of its power, turning what used to be a terrifying trap into something utterly transparent, boring, and weightless. This is precisely why an unmanipulatable empath becomes a genuinely terrifying force to someone whose entire identity relies on controlling others. When a person who once cared deeply about your opinion, your moods, and your approval completely steps out of the matrix of your influence, you lose all power over them. Think about it from the manipulator's perspective. Their entire playbook is built around fear, intimidation, and emotional reactivity. They rely on the quiet terror of losing the relationship to keep you compliant, walking on eggshells, and constantly seeking their validation. But that terrifying leverage completely evaporates the exact second you mentally and emotionally accept the worst-case scenario. When an empath looks at the relationship, looks at the threat of losing it, and genuinely realizes that walking away or losing you forever is actually a massive upgrade compared to staying in the chaos, you become utterly bulletproof. You simply cannot intimidate someone who has already made peace with losing you. This profound shift shatters every single control mechanism the manipulator has ever used, most notably their ability to weaponize guilt. Guilt only works as a leash if the other person values your judgment of their character. If an empath has stopped grading their own worth, their morality, and their identity based on your daily approval, your critiques, your silent treatments, and your disappointment bounce off them like feathers hitting a brick wall. They no longer internalize your toxic narrative about who they are. If you call them selfish, unreasonable, or cold, it no longer triggers a desperate internal panic or a frantic rush to defend themselves and prove their goodness. They simply look at your words, recognize them as a hollow projection of your own inner turmoil, and keep walking with complete internal peace. The mirror you are trying to hold up to them is shattered, and they refuse to look into it anymore. The most jarring part for a controller is that the newly unmanipulatable empath does not even bother to fight back. They do not start screaming matches. They do not launch counterattacks. They do not try to smear your name, and they do not waste precious energy trying to teach you a lesson. They simply, quietly, and permanently stop playing the game altogether. They stop reacting to the bait. When you throw a jab, they give you a polite blank nod. When you manufacture a crisis to pull them back into your drama, they respond with total, unbothered neutrality. They treat your frantic mind games with the same level of interest as watching paint dry on a rainy afternoon. They step entirely off the chessboard, leaving you standing there, holding all your pieces, with nobody left across from you to play. And that is why absolute, unbothered indifference is the single most devastating weapon an empath can ever wield against a manipulator. By design, manipulators are emotional vampires who feed on your panic, your tears, your anger, and your desperate attempts to fix things. They need your energy to sustain their cycle of control. When you cut off that supply completely and replace it with a calm, unshakable, heavy silence, you starve them out. They have zero defense against indifference because every tactic they throw requires a reaction to work. When you stop reacting, their power vanishes into thin air, leaving them to finally deal with the empty, echoing weight of their own destructive behavior.